Welcome to my fourth Out of the Unknown video, a 1960s BBC anthology sci-fi show, where most of the episodes are based on short stories and novels. And they're mostly not rewritten to hell and back. So if you want to know what old sci-fi was like without reading it, you could just get an audiobook, but this works too. Like many BBC shows in the 1960s, a lot of this is now missing. So this video, which is about 4 episodes, is half the surviving episodes from Series 2 and all the surviving episodes of Series 3. And one of them is half missing. This show was decimated. Worse, actually, much worse. Decimated means destroying 1/10. Much more than half of this is gone. But before I get into it, this is where, by law, I have to ask you to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. That sort of thing helps us with the algorithm. Also, comments. YouTube likes it when people talk. If you want to support the show more directly, then please consider helping out on Patreon. There's all kinds of rewards, including bonus videos and requests. But if you're not in a position to help out and can only watch, don't feel bad. And thanks for the views. Series 2, Episode 4 is Level 7, based on a novel by Mordechai Roshwald, and uniquely for the show, the guy who adapted it, J.B. Priestley, is much more famous than the author. Mordechai Roshwald was a Holocaust survivor from Ukraine and was a professor of the humanities, and Level 7 is his most famous work. Kind of fitting, as you'll find out. Well, J.B. Priestley was one of the most important writers of the mid-20th century UK. He had mainstream success writing novels, worked for the BBC during World War II and became the second most popular voice on the radio, after Churchill, was one of the socialist voices who influenced the creation of the welfare state, had a not literal fight with George Bernard Shaw over Shaw's affection for Stalin, and George Orwell once tried to get him blacklisted for being too left-wing. Orwell was a socialist, but he was also a hypocrite and kind of a dickhead. Priestley also wrote plays, was one of the big names that kept the London Philharmonic Orchestra afloat in the 40s, was offered a peerage to literally become a lord and turned it down, did some work for UNESCO, was a founder member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and when he had time, got really obsessed with precognitive dreaming. There's a giant statue of him outside the UK's National Science and Media Museum. On a notability level, this is kind of like C.S. Lewis adapting an episode. Adapting a story by a guy's Wikipedia article is 15 lines long, and one of them is his death. I don't mean any disrespect to Mordechai Roshwald, he's just kind of obscure. Honestly, I am impressed. Priestley is by far the biggest name to adapt a story for this show. But that's not the whole story. Priestley originally adapted Level 7 as a feature script, but it was never made, and that script eventually fell into producer Irene Stubik's lap, and it was cut down to fit the hour time limit, which apparently Priestley was not happy about. First up, I'm gonna have to spoil the ending. It is kind of a twist, but to talk about this, I need to talk about this. So if you don't want to be spoiled, go heen and miss most of the discussion. Level 7 is about a special military bunker where hundreds of people live permanently. Levels 1 to 4 are mostly civilian, 5 are scientists, and 6 and 7 are military. Level 7 is the deepest and most important. They are in control of launching nukes in the event of an atomic war. They have supplies for decades, and if the war does come, they're to stay there, isolated, procreate, and one day re-emerge and take back the planet. Of course, when it does come, it becomes clear that nobody's safe. One by one, they lose contact with the upper levels as fallout gets into the air filters and their colossal water supplies, and there's no way out. The novel was the diary of X-127, the last survivor of the base, and maybe the human race. He was called X-127 because everyone in Level 7 was assigned a number as a condition of working there, to make the people more like a cog in a vast machine of death. That's the in-universe explanation, but there's a real-world reason too. Oh, welcome back! Anyway, Roshwald deliberately structured the book so you couldn't tell what countries the characters were from, what side of the Cold War they were on. Even references to democracy were structured to be as applicable to American or Soviet democracy. Fun fact, the Soviets had a form of democracy. Roshwald wanted the book to both be neutral with regards to the Cold War and slanted, being against nuclear weapons. Perfect for a Holocaust survivor from Ukraine turned humanities professor in the United States. And even more perfect for Priestley, like I said, a founder member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, who called the book the most powerful attack on the whole nuclear madness that any creative writer has made so far. Level 7 is one of the most powerful episodes of Out of the Unknown, right on the cusp of plausible, especially at the height of the Cold War. But watching it is kind of spoiled, because it's a glimpse of what the film version could have been, not just with regards to budget and special effects. Priestley's script was almost cut in half for the episode, and it's a tragedy.
So listen to us, you people down there in the cave.
There's nothing to see here but twisted metal and radioactive dust.
Nothing.
Another dead planet.
Men and women, down there in the cave. We're dying, and we're glad.
Shubik said that she wanted to make something that was on a par with The War Game, Peter Watkins' masterpiece anti-nuclear film that had recently been finished. Watkins somehow got final cut on The War Game and refused to cut scenes where the police murder desperate survivors, so the BBC had it banned from TV. As a result, The War Game ended up eligible for an Oscar and won Best Documentary the next year, and became an absolute classic of the nuclear terror genre. Level 7's not quite that good, but who knows, that original film version might have been. For instance, check out this little exchange. X127 finds his former workmate, who was taken in by security, and hasn't been seen since, and then he finds him, demoted, working as a cleaner and lobotomized.
I remember things. Sunlight and other places. What's happened to it all?
We destroyed it.
What was wrong with it?
Because there was something wrong with us.
The fucked upness of the system in Level 7 is deep, multi-layered, horrific, and it takes a long time to get the bottom of, just like the complex itself. Level 7 was the last episode of Out of the Unknown to be found and returned, back in 2017. Lost TV searchers are still out there looking, so there's a chance that more will one day be found, but it's simply not a high priority like someone like Doctor Who, The Avengers, or even Dad's Army. We have 3 more missing stories after this. Second Childhood, an original story by Hugh Leonard, was about the dangers of rejuvenation. The World in Silence was based on 6 Cubed Plus 1 by John Rankine, a tale of computers linking students in a school, like a network to sinister ends. Honestly, it sounds a bit like School Reunion and New Who, but without the crillatine. Lastly, there was The Eye, based on a story by Henry Kuttner. It's a murder investigation in a world where everyone's vision is recorded from birth till death. So it's evidence. Fun concept. The next surviving episode is The Last Survivor from Series 2, Episode 8, The Tunnel Under the World by Frederik Pohl. I gave Pohl a long breakdown last episode as the Midas Plague was adapted from one of his stories, but here's the short version. Pohl was left-wing, fought in World War II, had a very long career in writing, even before he began writing himself, and was Isaac Asimov's only literary agent. The guy was quite fantastic, but that's a bit short, so I'll tell you about the historical importance of Tunnel Under the World. The story, not the episode. Tunnel Under the World was written in 1955 and might be the earliest example of the false reality trope. You know, the one where someone's existing in a normal world and piece by piece they discover that reality is not what they thought it was, that it's being constructed by someone else, usually for nefarious purposes, and they mean to keep the hero trapped. Examples include The Matrix, Dark City, 13th Floor, Truman Show, a bunch of Philip K. Dick, one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Star Trek multiple times, and many, many, many more. Like the Midas Plague, this was inspired by Pohl's left-wing politics, but not quite as obviously. Its main ire is advertising, dehumanization, and, of course, capitalism. It opens with our lead, Guy Burkett, having a nightmare about a local chemical plant exploding, and his wife Mary has the same nightmare.
It was only a dream.
But we both dreamed it.
They get blasted by loud, irritating advertising jingles throughout their day, but life mostly goes on as usual. Then that night, they have the same nightmare on the exact same day. Only the advertisements are different. And the adverts have an impact on their behaviour, encouraging them to buy a new fridge, try a new drink, that kind of thing. Then at work, Guy meets an old friend, Swanson, who tells him that it's the same day over and over again. Guy thinks he's snapped, but that night he discovers the wooden flooring and wall in his closet can be peeled off, and that there's metal and plastic underneath. In his surprise, he manages to knock himself out in the closet. And in the morning, he doesn't have the nightmare, but his wife does. And he realizes the passage of time, but his wife doesn't. He begins to notice that he's seeing some people in different guises, that some places suddenly look different, and he decides to seek out Swanson. And I'm not going to spoil anymore, you need to watch it for yourself, or read it, or look it up on YouTube, there's bound to be an audiobook there. It is one of the all-time great endings, several layered twists which aren't just shocking but fit perfectly with the theme, actually makes sense, and it was set up organically in the background of the story. It's just spectacular. It attacks advertising, capitalism, governmental manipulation, propaganda, dehumanization, even slavery and more. And its point is even more valid now than it was when Pohl wrote it. But the episode's not perfect, it's about advertising and its pernicious effects, and yet there's no TV adverts, just radio and messages broadcast on tracks. And the adverts are so annoying, but they somehow work.
What the hell's a feckle freezer?
Some kind of freezer, I suppose.
A feckle freezer.
12 cubic foot.
Self-defrosting?
Horizontal model.
Upright model. Price £275.
It could be that they're going for subliminal messaging, but I don't think so. And maybe the lack of TV adverts are because this is from the BBC, who are not allowed to have TV advertisements in their shows. Near the end, there's a couple of issues, such as a guy casually dropping what's going on into a conversation, just obviously enough to allow people to put it together early. And there's a robot that's nearly as bad as the ones in the Midas Plague. This show has a really bad track record with Frederik Pohl and robots. Though to be fair, that is meant to be an industrial robot, and they look a bit silly even in real life. The adaptation feels quite a bit like an extended episode of The Twilight Zone, but it says a lot about the quality of the story that Pohl created the false reality trope, and this is still an excellent example of it nearly 70 years later. I love Tunnel Under the World, it's just the right sort of angry and deranged. Fun fact, there's been a few film adaptations, but never just an adaptation. There's a French short film made in 1969, which is probably the closest thing to it, an Italian surrealist film, and Virtual Nightmare from the early 2000s, which changed almost everything, but is still quite good. And with that, the surviving episodes of Series 2 of Out of the Unknown are done. Oh, and fun fact, to make you very sad, there are 7 episodes between Tunnel Under the World and the next surviving episode, The Last Lonely Man, and almost half of them are from Isaac Asimov stories. You know, being a fan of old TV is shite sometimes, it's like enjoying Italian food, but every time you eat out you discover that half the ingredients were burned by some dickweed 15 years before you were born. Maybe if I wait a few more years, I might find some herbs in an old person's attic. The next 7 episodes are missing, the last 5 episodes of Series 2 and the first 2 of Series 3. Episodes 9 and 10 of Series 2 were based on stories by Larry Eisenberg. There's the fastest draw, an eccentric Texan billionaire, has built a replica town full of robots, and really wants to be the fastest draw. The billionaire was played by Ed Begley Sr., worth mentioning because he was quite a big star at the time, and foreign stars are few and far between in this show. Then there's Too Many Cooks. Andrew Cook creates a machine that can duplicate things, and ends up duplicated himself many, many times, and hijinks ensue. Walk's End comes next. It's an original story by William Trevor. It's about the elderly residents of a care home run by the suspicious Dr. Saint. They fear he's using them for organ transplants and other sinister purposes. The last 2 stories in Series 2 were Asimov's Satisfaction Guaranteed, in which a new type of human-looking robot is field-tested in a woman's house, and she falls in love with that. And The Prophet, where robots discover their own former religion. And if you recognize the robots in these still images, that's possibly because they were repainted white and used in The Mind Robber and Classic Who. Anyway, then on to Series 3, and with it, colour. Irene Shubik handed the production over to Alan Bromley, who had a long career in the BBC, but really kind of hated sci-fi, which makes him directing the Doctor Who story The Time Warrior a few years later kind of funny. Anyway, Bromley was put in charge, but as was the custom at the time, Irene Shubik had already selected the next series scripts, meaning Bromley was producing someone else's vision. So when he finally got to choose his scripts, things were going to change. But that's the next video. This is the series where the show transitioned to colour and remixed the intro. It's fine, but with the colour added, the stark, surreal original just looks kind of garish. I've gone on record saying the 60s Doctor Who looks better than 70s Doctor Who because the black and white, A, hides special effects issues, and B, really helps the obvious limitations feel more like a style. And the same applies to black and white versus colour out of the unknown. I might be the minority on this, but I really do prefer the black and white. It's stark and somehow feels less dated. Series 3 opens with the also missing Immortality Inc., based on a story by Robert Sheckley. Apparently the Beatles discuss watching it in Get Back, but I don't have a copy of that to check. Immortality Inc. involves a man from the then present having his consciousness sent forward and put into a new body. It was later very loosely adapted into the movie Free Jack, ironically starring Mick Jagger. Episode 2 was A Liar, based on the short story by Isaac Asimov. There's a robot that's unexpectedly developed telepathy. It can't harm humans, so it will lie about what it knows, eventually leading to accidental harm, which leads to a logical paradox and further problems. So many episodes are missing. Now, a fun fact, this short clip of a robot's head in Malcolm in the Middle's intro is a surviving clip from Liar. Media has the weirdest connections sometimes. Anyway, the next surviving episode is The Last Lonely Man, from a story by John Brunner. Brunner previously wrote Some Lapse in Time that I talked about in part 2, and I talked about him then. So like Pohl, here's the short version. He was a prolific writer, but never quite made it big. He had a tendency to burn bridges with publishers and other writers, but went above and beyond with fans. Now, Some Lapse in Time was a story that didn't make a great deal of sense, but it got by in its incredibly heavy atmospheric vibes. And The Last Lonely Man definitely has the first thing in common. We open with a fantastically ominous sequence as a young couple are out driving, and check this out. Foreshadowing. The couple crash and are killed, and the police check for contact details. The UK has instituted a kind of mental organ donation system. Basically, when you die, your mind is added to someone else's so you can live on. And the sequence with the couple was a government PSA to advertise that.
They're mutuals only. Neither had contact with a third party.
You know, I have watched a lot of old UK government films, and that recreates the style perfectly.
Might you have been caught like this young couple?
Anyway, the plot follows James Hale, a typical middle-class man who's contracted with his wife. One night out in the pub, he meets Patrick, who's been expunged from his only contact. They get drunk, and James is sympathetic to Patrick's terror at the idea of actual, real death, and agrees to sign him up as his contact. Of course, James starts to regret this, because there's a reason that Patrick's previous contracts expunged him. He's unbalanced, paranoid, violent, prone to drinking, and eventually suicidal.
Is he coming over?
Yes! Yes!
Well, stop him! Stop him!
I can't! I can't!
I'm gonna stop there, though what happens is not exactly a twist. This really has similar issues to Some Lapse in Time, in that there's really obvious logical problems with the plot. For instance, the whole plot turns on James and Patrick setting up to each other's contacts when they're both extremely drunk. There's no waiting period, you don't need to be sober, you don't need the okay from anyone else who'd been inhabiting the same brain if you died, like his wife. Because if any of these obvious safeguards were in place, the plot could not happen. At least Some Lapse of Time had some serious vibes to get you through the nonsensical plot. This is just nonsensical. At least on some level it realises that. There's a scene with a psychiatrist who explains the very obvious issues with the concept.
I mean, take that couple in here just now. Man's got landed with some neurotic fellow. Two totally incompatible personalities.
And apparently, if he's to be believed, then the government just pushed this through while ignoring the medical experts. Okay, that part is kind of realistic. And on top of that, you get one of the worst staged bits in the entire show.
I mean, how do you cope with a nation of bisexuals? Because that's what they're going to be if this goes on much longer. Bisexuals.
Homosexuals, surely, sir, to be more specific.
Queers, then.
Jesus.
But apart from all that, there is one fantastic moment in this. One of the great moments in the show. An audience at the cinema is watching a violent movie made before the mind transference was invented. And they're laughing at all the death. Because death has become a joke. Anyway, The Last Lonely Man's fine. The central idea is beyond flawed, but the world building around it is mostly good. There are great moments, and George Cole, who plays James, gives a really good performance as a decent, kinda weak, and sympathetic guy. And the monster he's forced to become. Anyway, the next 4 episodes are missing. The first is Beachhead, based on a story by Clifford Simak, which has a reconstruction, and I'll be talking about it in the last video. After that is Something in the Cellar, an original story by Donald Bull. This sees Milo O'Shea from Come Buttercup, Come Daisy Come return. He plays a scientist who's built an advanced computer in his cellar, but it develops a malevolent personality of its own, his dead mother's. Apparently Milo O'Shea got typecast as hapless fools who get controlled by things that they made/grew. Next is Random Quest, based on a story by John Wyndham. It's about a scientist who's caught in an explosion and finds himself in a parallel universe, living a very different life. This footage is from a later BBC adaptation. Up next is The Naked Sun, based on the story by Isaac Asimov, and there's a reconstruction, so we're talking about it later on. The last remaining episode of Series 3 was The Little Black Bag, and it's half missing, adapted from a story by Cyril Kornbluth. I think Kornbluth might be the only writer in Out of the Unknown who had died before his episode was produced. He died in 1958, aged 34. According to several of his peers, he was an eccentric and apparently once read a complete set of encyclopedias, A to Z, as research, inserting random knowledge that he'd learned into his stories. Though he died young, he did start early, writing his first story when he was 7. Even though his writing was interrupted by serving in World War II, he was quite prolific, and he collaborated with a number of other authors. I get the impression that if he'd lived longer, he'd have had a very long, interesting career. And in case you were curious, he wasn't shot or committed suicide or anything. He ran for a train and had a heart attack. Just a tragic random death. The Little Black Bag is probably Kornbluth's most famous work, and like I said earlier, the episode is half missing. But luckily, it was also adapted over 10 years earlier into an episode of Tales of Tomorrow!
Science fiction dramas that explore the unknown.
The first OG, original, granddaddy of them all, progenitor, example, inaugural, primeval, and even earliest sci-fi anthology show. And through a weird quirk, as in not being made by the episode murdering BBC, most of its episodes are still around, including The Little Black Bag. So I'll be using footage from the Tales of Tomorrow version wherever necessary, as though this was Jurassic Park and it was a frog.
We use the complete DNA of a frog to fill in the holes and complete the code.
The Little Black Bag was also adapted by Night Gallery, and that version also exists, so I could use that one, but Night Gallery is downright pedestrian compared to Tales of Tomorrow. It is so old that a couple of episodes featured charity appeals for the ongoing European refugee crisis. The aftermath of World War II. Side note, but if you want me to talk about Tales of Tomorrow, leave a comment. It's a very interesting show. Their version of Frankenstein is hilarious. The monster gets shot in the dick. Anyway, The Little Black Bag. The main characters are Dr. Fool and Angie. In Tales of Tomorrow, he's a failure of a doctor and she's his nagging wife. In Out of the Unknown, he's an alcoholic former doctor who was kicked out of the profession for manslaughtering a patient, and she's his nagging business partner. There's only 15 years between the two adaptations, but that is a really big difference. Though Out of the Unknown has twice the runtime to play with. Now, the first half of the Out of the Unknown version is missing, so here's where Tales of Tomorrow comes in. At his lowest point, Dr. Full finds the titular Little Black Bag. In Tales of Tomorrow, it's in a pawn shop. According to Out of the Unknown, a guide to the legendary BBC series. In Out of the Unknown, it just appears in his office. And soon enough, he's called in to help a sick little girl and discovers the bag's amazing secret. It can cure anything.
Come here, quickly.
I don't believe it.
It's a medical bag from the future, the 25th century in the short story and Tales of Tomorrow, and the 21st century in Out of the Unknown. It got sent back in time in an accident with a newly invented time machine. Much of the missing first act of the Out of the Unknown version dealt with how it ended up in the past, while Tales of Tomorrow just kind of glances over at. Anyway, after saving the girl's life, Dr. Pohl and Angie see the potential in the bag's powers and set up a clinic. But Pohl, for all his issues, wants to use it to help humanity. He wants to give it to science, while Angie, being a bit of a Lady Macbeth figure, just wants the money, leading to much drama, murder, and a very ironic ending. Anyway, kind of a generic episode overall. It really felt less like Out of the Unknown and more like something like the Twilight Zone. Even more than Tunnel Under the World, and at least Tunnel Under the World felt like a really good episode of the Twilight Zone. But the two leads, Maurice Jones and Geraldine Moffat, both play their roles fantastically, giving them much more pathos and depth than the versions in Tales of Tomorrow, though the double-length script no doubt helped. And I loved how the contents of the bag actually looked futuristic. In Out of the Unknown, the future scalpel, for instance, looks almost exactly like a future scalpel in Alien. In Tales of Tomorrow, they were basically normal, then modern-looking medical equipment that cured everything and never ran out. It's a good look all round for the future. We get a couple of surviving future scenes later on in the episode. And while the set does look a bit generic, it looks legitimately futuristic, as in it looks like it was made in the early 80s, and this was 1969. And check out the look of the weirdly vibrant colour of the outfits. I'm not sure how they did it, but it gets across that simple things like dyes have really changed over the years. And I am sure it is a special effect, some post-production, because the guys wearing the costumes look weirdly pale. Originally, I assumed it was a leftover from some colour restoration tech, because it looks a little bit like some John Pertwee Doctor Who episodes that have the colour restored from black and white copies, and not colorized. A Doctor Who nerd actually invented a tech to analyse a black and white copy of a colour film to work out what colours are there and recreate them. Anyway, that's what I thought was being done here, but then I noticed the scenes set in the present look kind of normal. So that is the episode itself. Oh, fun fact. Cyril Kornbluth was asked by writer Frederik Pohl, writer of The Midas Plague and Tunnel Under the World, to do a sequel to The Little Black Bag, which takes a look at the future that created the bag. You see, Pohl wanted to know what sort of society would create a medical device that can cure anything, but is so easy to use that someone from 500 years in the past could use it without any problems. How could something so advanced have such a low barrier to entry? And Kornbluth came up with the Marching Morons, where the future is dominated by stupid people with a minority of extremely smart people. A man from the modern day is frozen and wakes up in this future, and the smart minority task him to deal with the world's problems. So the average man, armed with self-confidence and a rough knowledge of Nazi war atrocities, starts to genocide the stupid, and when the job is complete, the really smart people kill him for doing it. So, like my short on the subject said, it's a gritty pre-bit of Idiocracy. To my knowledge, Mike Judge has never said that the Marching Morons inspired Idiocracy, but the average man from the present even had the same initials as the guy in Idiocracy. I'll take it as read. One film that was open about taking inspiration from the Marching Morons, though, was RoboCop. They even gave it a direct shout-out. You see, in the Marching Morons, the stupid love a TV show with the catchphrase, "Would you buy that for $1?" And with inflation and RoboCop it became,
"I'd buy that for $1."
The last 5 episodes of Series 3 are missing. 1.1 equals 1.5 was the original story by Brian Hales, who created the Toy Maker, the Ice Warriors, and the Planet Peladon for Doctor Who. This was a drama set in a future Britain with strict population controls. A high-ranking population control officer discovers that his wife is pregnant with an unlicensed child. So, it's basically Fortress. Next is The Fosters, from an original story by Michael Ash. It's a suburban street, and one of the families, the Fosters, seems to have scientific knowledge far in advance of the modern day. Target Generation comes next, and it's based on a story by Clifford Simak. It had previously been adapted for Out of This World, the precursor series to Out of the Unknown. It's about a generation ship, and the people on board have developed a religion unique to their situation. Who are Target Generation? It's like an anti-Stranger in the Family. 2 adaptations in the 60s and both are gone. Next is The Little Yellow Pill, based on a story by Rog Phillips, another story that was previously adapted for Out of This World. This one kind of exists, a bit. There's an audio track and there's been a reconstruction. So I'll be covering that in my final video about missing episodes. And lastly, we have Get Off My Cloud, possibly the most notable lost episode, an actual Doctor Who crossover. It even featured the Daleks and the TARDIS, but none of the characters. And I'll be talking about it, again, in the episode about missing interesting stories. Anyway, that brings me to the end of Series 3. Out of the 4 complete stories I've covered here, it is pretty hard to work out what's best and worst, because both Level 7 and Tunnel Under the World are fantastic, and The Last Lonely Man and The Little Black Bag kind of aren't. As for which is best, you've got a choice between Tunnel Under the World, pretty much as good a version of itself as you're ever going to get, or Level 7, not quite as good, but you know you were denied a much better, longer, more expansive version that probably would have blown Tunnel Under the World out of the water. I'll go with Tunnel Under the World, but if you prefer Level 7, I understand. As for the worst, we've got The Last Lonely Man, a story that falls much further than The Little Black Bag, and makes much less sense, but its heights are much higher. The scene in the cinema, for instance, and George Cole's central performance. So I'm not even sure I can choose between them. If you've seen them, let me know what you think. Now, although only 2 stories from Series 3 still exist, 3 other stories, Beachhead, the episode These Great Little Aliens Come From, The Naked Sun, another Isaac Asimov, one of the iRobot stories, and The Little Yellow Pill, basically a prototype Philip K. Dick story, though not actually by Philip K. Dick, still exist in bits and pieces. There's a complete audio track, and the DVD release features hybrid reconstructions of the episodes, part telesnaps with the still images, and part animation and stuff. And I'll be covering all 3 of these in a later video about the missing stories, but just the reconstructions and a handful of notable others. I'm not insane. Anyway, join me soonish for part 5, where I talk about all the surviving episodes of Series 4, where the show gets a fancy new intro and turns into a horror series that occasionally touches on technology. And we'll discuss, by far, the most controversial episode of the show, and not, like, in a fun way, in a